Hey guys, tonight we explore one of the oldest and strangest human habits ever created: clothing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For most of early human history, our ancestors probably wore absolutely nothing at all. No shirts, no shoes, no trousers, no tiny decorative scarves whose only purpose is making winter somehow less comfortable. Just groups of nervous humans wandering through dangerous landscapes, completely exposed to weather, insects, sharp rocks, and every poor decision nature could invent. At first, this was not necessarily a problem. Early humans evolved in warm African climates where clothing was mostly unnecessary. In fact, humans had already lost much of their body hair millions of years earlier. Scientists believe this happened partly because sweating became extremely important for endurance hunting. While most animals overheated after long chases, humans could continue jogging slowly for hours beneath the sun until prey finally collapsed from exhaustion. So humanity's evolutionary advantage became persistent sweating, a truly majestic beginning for our species. But losing fur created obvious problems almost immediately. Cold nights became miserable. Rain became miserable. Thorny bushes became miserable. Sitting on cold rocks became miserable. Honestly, early humanity spent a shocking amount of time simply discovering new forms of discomfort. Without thick fur, human skin was vulnerable to cuts, insect bites, sunburn, frost, and rough terrain. Other animals arrived in nature fully equipped. Bears received fur coats. Turtles received armor. Humans received anxiety and slightly improved stamina. At first, people probably used temporary coverings rather than proper clothing. Animal hides draped across the shoulders during cold weather. Leaves wrapped around sensitive areas while crossing rough terrain. Primitive sandals may have protected feet from sharp stones. Nothing matched. Nobody cared about aesthetics yet. There was no prehistoric fashion critic standing beside the river saying, "Honestly, the mammoth skin washes you out." The oldest clothing existed purely because survival kept interrupting comfort. Archaeologists believe humans started wearing regular clothing somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago. And strangely enough, one of the biggest clues comes from lice. Human body lice evolved separately from head lice, and body lice survive specifically inside clothing. By studying these parasites genetically, scientists estimated when humans began consistently wearing garments. So one of the greatest discoveries about civilization came from examining prehistoric bugs hiding in ancient loincloths. Human history is occasionally less glamorous than documentaries suggest. Early clothing itself was deeply unpleasant by modern standards. Animal hides were heavy, stiff, itchy, and smelled extraordinary in the worst possible way. Wet fur trapped odours beautifully. Imagine wearing damp deer skin beside a smoky fire for 3 straight weeks with no soap, no toothpaste, and no concept of personal space. Romantic depictions of prehistoric life tend to skip over the constant smell of wet animal and human exhaustion. Still, clothing changed everything. Humans could survive colder climates, migrate across dangerous regions, and endure brutal winters that would otherwise kill them quickly. A stitched fur garment may not sound revolutionary now, but at the time it was essentially prehistoric technology at its peak. And unfortunately, once humans realized clothing could protect the body, it did not take long before they realized clothing could impress other humans too. That was the moment this entire situation became permanently ridiculous. For thousands of years, early humans survived reasonably well in warmer climates with minimal clothing. Then the Ice Age arrived and ruined absolutely everything. Suddenly, large parts of Europe and Asia became brutally cold landscapes filled with snow, freezing winds, and animals large enough to flatten a human accidentally while simply existing nearby. Temperatures dropped to deadly levels. Nights became unbearable. Entire regions turned into frozen environments, where a naked human could survive for approximately 3 minutes before becoming an educational warning for the rest of the tribe. Humanity had a serious problem. Unlike mammoths, humans had no thick fur. Unlike wolves, humans had no insulating coats. Unlike bears, Humans could not simply hibernate through winter while looking majestic. Humans entered the Ice Age equipped with determination, basic tools, and a level of confidence wildly unsupported by biology. Clothing stopped being optional very quickly. Animal hides became essential for survival. Hunters used the skins of reindeer, bison, wolves, and mammoths to create primitive coverings. Ironically, the same animals trying to kill humans often became humanity's best protection against freezing weather afterward. Nature really enjoys recycling, but making useful clothing was incredibly difficult. Fresh hides rotted quickly. Wet fur became heavy and foul-smelling. Frozen skins turned stiff as wood. Early humans had to scrape fat from hides using stone tools, dry them carefully, soften them repeatedly, and eventually stitch pieces together using bone needles and animal sinew. This process probably took enormous effort. One proper winter outfit may have required multiple animal hides and days of labour. And unlike modern clothing stores, there was no exchange policy if the stitching failed halfway through a snowstorm. Archaeologists have discovered ancient bone needles dating back tens of thousands of years, proving early humans developed surprisingly advanced sewing techniques. These were not random fur blankets anymore. Humans were now creating fitted garments, boots, gloves, hoods, and layered clothing designed specifically for survival. And honestly, layered clothing probably saved humanity as a species. Without proper garments, humans could never have migrated deep into colder regions. Entire populations would have frozen during winter migrations. Clothing allowed humans to spread across continents, hunt in extreme climates, and eventually dominate environments that should have killed them outright. But something else happened too. Once humans began wearing clothing regularly, people naturally started noticing whose clothing looked better. One hunter had cleaner fur, another had softer hides. Someone decorated boots with beads or teeth. Suddenly, survival equipment slowly became social competition. Humanity had officially discovered fashion, and from that moment onward, history became an endless cycle of humans making clothing increasingly impractical in order to impress other humans who were secretly also uncomfortable. At some point, early humans crossed a very important line in history. Clothing stopped being only about survival and quietly became something else entirely: social competition. Because once everyone in the tribe was no longer freezing to death equally, people naturally started noticing details. One hunter had thicker fur, another wore cleaner hides, someone stitched beads into a cloak, someone else decorated boots with animal teeth, and somewhere in prehistory, one exhausted human probably looked at another exhausted human and thought, honestly, his mammoth cape is a bit excessive. That was the beginning of fashion. The strange thing about humans is that we almost immediately turn useful objects into social signals. Food becomes luxury cuisine. Houses become status symbols. Weapons become ceremonial decorations. And clothing quickly became one of the easiest ways to display skill, wealth, power, and attractiveness without speaking at all. A well-made outfit suggested many things. It meant you or your family had access to successful hunters. It showed sewing ability, resource access, and survival knowledge. Decorative items suggested spare time and stability. In harsh, prehistoric conditions, having enough extra energy to decorate clothing was itself a flex. "Look at me," said the man wearing wolf teeth around his neck. "I survived winter and still had time for accessories." Different groups also began developing distinct styles. Certain tribes preferred specific animal furs, patterns, ornaments, or dyes. Clothing slowly became tied to identity. People could recognize allies, rivals, or outsiders simply by appearance. Humans had invented visual tribal branding thousands of years before modern companies started putting tiny crocodiles on polo shirts. Decoration expanded rapidly. Shells, feathers, bones, beads, ivory, and carved ornaments appeared across ancient garments. Some items likely carried spiritual meaning. Others probably existed simply because humans enjoy showing off. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient beads over 100,000 years old, proving humanity became emotionally attached to decoration almost immediately after discovering survival, which honestly explains a lot about modern civilization. The most impressive part is that all this happened while daily life remained unbelievably brutal. People still faced starvation, disease, predators, freezing temperatures, and violent injuries constantly. Yet even surrounded by danger, humans still found time to think. Yes, but this cloak could use more decorative shells. and perhaps that is one of the most human traits imaginable. Even in prehistoric times, people wanted to feel respected, admired, attractive, or important. Clothing became part survival tool, part emotional armor. It helped humans express identity long before writing existed. Unfortunately, this also created a new problem humanity still suffers from today: judging strangers entirely based on what they are wearing. A tradition we have somehow maintained with remarkable consistency for tens of thousands of years. For early humans, one of the greatest technological breakthroughs in history was not the wheel, metalworking, or agriculture. It was poking holes into dead animal skin with sharp objects. Not glamorous, certainly, but incredibly important. At first, prehistoric clothing was probably little more than hides draped loosely across the body. Effective enough for basic warmth, but terrible during storms, hunting trips, or long migrations. Loose skins slipped constantly, trapped moisture poorly, and made movement awkward. Trying to run through snow while holding together a falling fur blanket was not ideal for survival. Eventually, humans developed tools that changed everything. Bone needles. Archaeologists have discovered finely crafted needles dating back tens of thousands of years. Some so small and precise they look surprisingly modern. These were not crude sharpened sticks either. Many had carefully carved eyes for threading sinew or plant fibers. Which means somewhere in Ice Age history, a prehistoric human sat patiently inventing sewing while everyone else nearby was trying not to freeze to death. That person deserves more appreciation, honestly. Sewing allowed humans to create fitted clothing for the first time. Sleeves, leg coverings, boots, gloves, hoods, layered garments that trapped heat efficiently and stayed secure during movement. Suddenly, humans could survive environments that previously would have killed them almost immediately. This was especially important during migrations into northern Europe and Siberia. Temperatures in these regions were absolutely brutal. Without proper stitched clothing, entire groups would have frozen during winter. Fur alone was not enough. Clothing needed structure, layering, and insulation. And unlike modern winter jackets, prehistoric clothing had no zippers, synthetic fibers, or waterproof coatings. If your boots failed during a snowstorm, there was no customer support department. Nature simply removed you from the conversation permanently. Different animals also provided different materials. Reindeer hides insulated well. Fur-lined boots protected feet from frostbite. Sinew from animal tendons became durable thread. Early humans learned which materials worked best through generations of trial and error, which is a polite historical way of saying many people probably froze horribly while everyone else took notes. Clothing also began reflecting increasing specialization inside human groups. Some individuals likely became skilled specifically at preparing hides and sewing garments. In many prehistoric societies, clothing production probably required enormous labor and knowledge. A well-made outfit was valuable property, not something casually replaced every season, because a magazine declared brown emotionally outdated, and perhaps that is what makes early clothing so fascinating. Every stitch represented survival. A fur cloak was not just decoration, it meant warmth, protection, mobility, and life itself. Humans survived the Ice Age not because they were the strongest animals on Earth, but because they learned how to adapt creatively. Also because mammoths came with built-in winter coats, which humanity very opportunistically borrowed afterward. At some point in human history, clothing stopped being only practical and became something far more dangerous. Attractive. Once basic survival was under control, humans began using clothing to impress each other. And honestly, this was inevitable. Humans cannot leave anything simple for very long. Give people a useful invention, and eventually someone will decorate it unnecessarily in hopes of finding romance. Early clothing likely started gaining symbolic meaning thousands of years ago. Certain furs became associated with strength or hunting skill. Decorative beads suggested status. Rare feathers, shells, and animal teeth displayed success, bravery, or wealth. Humans had discovered that appearance could influence social standing long before written language even existed. A person wearing beautifully crafted clothing immediately stood out. And attraction mattered enormously in prehistoric societies. Survival depended heavily on group cooperation, family bonds, and reproduction. Looking healthy, capable, and resourceful increased social value. Clothing became part of that signal. A well-dressed hunter appeared skilled. A carefully decorated woman might signal family connections, craftsmanship, or access to valuable resources. In simple terms, prehistoric humans accidentally invented peacocking. Other animals already did similar things. Birds displayed bright feathers. Deer grew antlers. Humans stitched wolf teeth onto cloaks and thought, this should help. And to be fair, it probably did. Archaeologists have discovered ancient beads and ornaments dating back over 100,000 years. Some were crafted from shells transported enormous distances, suggesting people traded decorative items long before they traded anything particularly practical. Humanity saw shiny objects and collectively decided, yes, we'll walk 200 miles for this tiny polished rock. Body decoration expanded alongside clothing. Early humans painted skin, tattooed bodies, braided hair, and wore jewellery made from bone, ivory, stone, and animal parts. Clothing became part of a much larger social language. It communicated age, status, group identity, experience, and attractiveness without speaking at all. And importantly, this changed human behaviour permanently. Once appearance became socially meaningful, people began caring deeply about what others thought of them. Embarrassment, pride, envy, admiration. Clothing started triggering emotions far beyond simple warmth. Humans were no longer just surviving nature. They were surviving each other's opinions, which, historically speaking, becomes much more exhausting. Different groups also developed beauty standards. Some admired elaborate decorations. Others valued rare materials or specific colours. Across thousands of years and countless cultures, one thing remained remarkably consistent. Humans willingly made life more uncomfortable in order to look impressive. That pattern begins here, deep in prehistory, beside fires and animal skin tents. And eventually, it leads directly to powdered wigs, corsets, impossible shoes, and modern designer clothing that cost the same as a small medieval farm, while containing approximately 4 teaspoons of actual fabric. For a very long time, humans probably viewed nakedness the same way animals still do now, completely normal. A deer does not wake up feeling embarrassed. Wolves are not hiding behind trees discussing body confidence issues. Most animals simply exist without worrying whether anyone is judging their thighs. Humans, however, eventually became psychologically complicated. As societies grew larger and more organized, clothing slowly became tied to ideas of privacy, morality, sexuality, and social order. Modesty was not invented overnight. It developed gradually across thousands of years as humans formed permanent settlements, religions, family structures, and increasingly strict social expectations. In small prehistoric groups, survival mattered far more than embarrassment. But once larger communities emerged, human behaviour became more regulated. Clothing started separating public life from private life. Certain body parts became sexualized. Rules appeared. Customs formed. Humanity began the endless historical tradition of deciding which random areas of the body were scandalous this century. And honestly, the results were wildly inconsistent. In some ancient cultures, exposed legs were shocking, while bare chests were perfectly normal. In others, hair became deeply sexualized. Some societies demanded heavy coverings, while others barely cared about nudity at all. Human modesty rules often make less sense the longer you study them. The ancient Egyptians, for example, wore relatively light clothing because of the hot climate. Greek athletes sometimes competed entirely nude. Meanwhile, later societies could become deeply offended by exposed ankles. Humanity somehow travelled from public Olympic nudity to that woman's elbow is causing moral collapse. Religion also played a massive role. As spiritual systems developed, clothing became linked to purity, discipline, and social identity. Priests wore special garments. Religious laws regulated fabrics, hairstyles, coverings, and jewellery. In many societies, controlling appearance became a way of controlling behaviour itself. And once morality entered fashion, things became exhausting permanently. Clothing now carried emotional and social consequences. A person dressed incorrectly could appear disrespectful, immoral, poor, rebellious, or dangerous. Fashion stopped being only personal. It became political, religious, and cultural all at once. This also explains why humans become strangely emotional about clothing even today. Across history, arguments over clothing have sparked outrage, laws, punishments, protests and endless public debates. Entire civilizations have genuinely panicked over skirts, trousers, wigs, sleeves, hats, and visible knees. Imagine explaining that to an early hunter from 40,000 years ago. Yes, we covered ourselves to survive winter. Reasonable. And eventually people started fighting over whether shoulders were inappropriate. Perhaps the mammoths should have won. Still, modesty gave clothing deeper meaning. Garments became symbols of identity, belonging, respectability, and adulthood. Humans no longer wore clothing simply because nature was cold. They wore it because society was watching. And unfortunately for humanity, society never really stops watching once it starts. As human civilizations grew larger, clothing stopped being just personal expression and became something far more powerful, a way to separate people. Very quickly, societies realized clothing could instantly reveal wealth, status, profession, religion, and power, without anyone speaking a single word. A king dressed differently from a farmer. Priests wore sacred garments. Soldiers wore uniforms. Merchants displayed expensive fabrics. Slaves and laborers often wore rough, simple clothing designed more for practicality than dignity. Humanity had invented visual hierarchy, and people became obsessed with it. In ancient Egypt, wealthy elites wore fine linen, while workers dressed far more simply beneath the brutal desert heat. In Rome, senators wore specific purple-striped togas reserved only for their class. In medieval Europe, some governments even passed sumptuary laws, controlling who could wear certain colours, furs, or jewellery. Imagine being arrested because your hat looked financially overconfident. Purple dye became especially famous because it was incredibly expensive to produce. In some ancient societies, purple clothing was restricted almost entirely to royalty and emperors. Thousands of sea snails had to be processed just to create small amounts of dye. Entire coastlines reportedly smelled horrific from production. Humanity looked at mountains of rotting shellfish and thought, yes, this will symbolize elegance. And somehow it worked. Clothing also became deeply tied to labor. Farmers needed durable garments. Hunters required mobility. Nobles preferred decorative clothing, proving they did not perform physical work themselves. Long sleeves, delicate fabrics, pale skin, and elaborate accessories all quietly communicated the same message. I am wealthy enough not to carry heavy objects, which remains surprisingly consistent even today. The richer societies became, the more impractical elite fashion often grew. Massive robes, delicate embroidery, impossible hairstyles, and restrictive garments showed that wealthy people had servants, free time, and protection from ordinary labor. Clothing evolved into visible proof that someone lived differently from everyone else. And naturally, lower classes copied elite styles whenever possible. This triggered a cycle repeated throughout history endlessly. The rich adopted new fashions to distinguish themselves. Everyone else imitated them. The elites then changed styles again to remain socially separate. Humanity essentially turned fabric into an endless psychological arms race. Even military clothing reflected status. Decorative armor, cloaks, feathers, medals, and ceremonial uniforms transformed warfare into something halfway between survival and theater. Some commanders dressed so elaborately they practically glowed on battlefields, which seems strategically questionable, honestly. But perhaps the strangest part is how quickly humans accepted this system. People began making assumptions instantly based on appearance. Respect, trust, fear, attraction, and authority all became connected to clothing. And once civilization reached that stage, clothing stopped being just protection from nature. It became protection from social judgment too, which for many humans across history probably felt significantly more terrifying. As civilizations became more organized, clothing slowly transformed into something sacred. People no longer dressed only for warmth, beauty, or status. Now clothing also carried spiritual meaning. Priests wore special robes. Religious leaders covered specific body parts. Certain fabrics became holy while others became forbidden. Humanity had officially reached the stage where even pants could offend the gods under the wrong circumstances. And surprisingly, many ancient people took these rules extremely seriously. In ancient Egypt, priests often shaved their bodies completely and wore carefully cleaned linen garments during rituals. Purity mattered enormously. In Mesopotamia, temple workers wore symbolic robes connected to divine authority. Ancient Jewish laws regulated fabrics, coverings, and ritual garments in extraordinary detail. Later, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, and countless other traditions developed their own clothing customs tied to morality and spirituality. Suddenly, getting dressed each morning could become a religious statement. Clothing helped distinguish sacred spaces from ordinary life. Priests dressed differently because they represented something beyond everyday society. Their garments symbolized wisdom, authority, purity, sacrifice, or closeness to the divine. Of course, humans being humans, religion and status quickly became tangled together. Religious clothing often became expensive, elaborate, and politically powerful. Golden embroidery, silk robes, jeweled crowns, ceremonial fabrics imported from distant lands. Some temples possessed wardrobes wealthier than entire villages, which must have been slightly frustrating for starving peasants standing outside, while priests discussed spiritual humility in gemstone-covered robes. But symbolism mattered deeply in ancient societies. Colours carried meaning. White represented purity in some cultures. Black symbolized mourning or authority. Purple suggested divine kingship. Even hairstyles and beard length could hold religious importance. And once societies attached morality to clothing, judgment followed immediately. Certain garments became associated with virtue, while others suggested corruption or rebellion. Covering the body became tied to discipline and self-control. Entire communities began monitoring appearance constantly. A person dressed incorrectly could appear sinful, disrespectful, or dangerous. Humanity had invented moral fashion policing, and the rules were often inconsistent. Some religions valued simplicity and modesty. Others embraced magnificent ceremonial clothing as proof of divine glory. One culture praised shaved heads, while another praised long hair. One society demanded veils, while another celebrated exposed skin in sacred rituals, which really highlights an important truth about human civilization. People can assign deep spiritual meaning to almost anything if given enough time. Still, religious clothing served an important purpose. It created identity, belonging, and continuity across generations. A robe, veil, or symbol connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Unfortunately, it also meant humanity entered another endless historical phase, arguing passionately about what everyone else should wear. A debate that thousands of years later, modern society continues with exhausting enthusiasm. Once clothing became tied to religion, status, and identity, it was only a matter of time before governments started interfering too. Because throughout history, rulers quickly realized something important. Controlling how people dress is often an easy way to control society itself, and humans absolutely love telling other humans what they are allowed to wear. Ancient governments introduced laws regulating fabrics, colours, jewellery, hairstyles, and decorations. These were known as sumptuary laws, and they existed across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East for centuries. Their purpose was simple: keep social classes visually separated. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, peasants were often forbidden from wearing luxurious materials like silk, velvet, or expensive fur. Certain colours were reserved for nobles or royalty. In some cities, only specific classes could wear gold embroidery or jewelled accessories. Imagine saving money your entire life for one nice outfit, only for the government to arrive and say, "Unfortunately, that fabric is above your tax bracket." And honestly, rulers were terrified of clothing for one major reason: appearance could blur social boundaries. If wealthy merchants dressed like nobles, or ordinary people imitated aristocratic fashion, the entire social hierarchy became visually confusing. Clothing helped maintain order. Kings wanted peasants looking like peasants. Nobles wanted to appear obviously superior. Society depended heavily on everyone recognizing their place immediately from 50 feet away. Fashion became a form of political stability. This was especially true in empires. Roman officials wore specific togas marking rank and authority. Chinese dynasties regulated court dress in extraordinary detail. Japanese samurai followed strict clothing traditions tied to class and loyalty. Across civilizations, governments repeatedly used appearance to reinforce obedience, and naturally people constantly broke these rules. For most of early history, clothing changed very slowly. A tunic remained a tunic for generations. A fur cloak stayed practical because freezing to death never really went out of style. But as civilizations grew richer and trade expanded, something strange happened. Humans began changing clothing deliberately just because they were bored. Fashion trends were born, and honestly, civilization has never emotionally recovered from this development. Once cities became wealthier, clothing evolved faster than ever before. New fabrics arrived from distant lands. Silk travelled along trade routes from China. Dyes became more sophisticated. Tailors experimented with cuts, sleeves, patterns, and decorations. Wealthy people suddenly had access to variety, and humanity immediately transformed that variety into competition. 1 year long robes became fashionable. The next year, shorter robes appeared. Shoes widened, narrowed, pointed, or thickened, depending entirely on the collective mood of society. Entire populations began replacing perfectly functional clothing simply because somebody important decided sleeves should look different now, which remains deeply impressive from a psychological standpoint. Ancient Rome saw dramatic fashion shifts between republican simplicity and imperial luxury. Medieval Europe became obsessed with pointed shoes so long some nobles struggled to walk properly. Renaissance elites competed through absurdly elaborate fabrics and bright colours. In some periods, men's hats became so enormous they practically deserved separate tax categories. And every generation believed their current fashion choices represented civilization at its peak. People also began mocking older styles aggressively. Clothing became tied to youth, relevance, and social belonging. Nobody wanted to look outdated. Imagine surviving famine, plague, war, and dangerous childbirth only to be told your sleeves were no longer fashionable. Humanity's priorities have always been fascinating. Fashion trends also spread through imitation. Royals influenced nobles. Nobles influenced merchants. Merchants influenced commoners. Travellers carried styles between cities and kingdoms. Clothing became one of the earliest forms of mass cultural communication. And importantly, trends created industries. Tailors, dyers, weavers, jewellers, leatherworkers, and cloth merchants all benefited from constant demand for new styles. Fashion stopped being occasional decoration and became permanent economic machinery. Entire cities grew wealthy, producing textiles and luxury garments, which meant humanity had officially discovered consumer culture. People now purchased clothing not only because they needed it, but because they wanted social approval, admiration, attraction, or status. The emotional connection between identity and appearance became stronger with every century, and this process accelerated endlessly. Because once humans discovered they could reinvent themselves through clothing, fashion stopped being about protection entirely. It became aspiration, fantasy, performance. A poor man could dress like a wealthy man. A nervous person could appear powerful. A ruler could dress like a god, all through fabric. Which is remarkable when you remember this entire story began with exhausted prehistoric humans wrapping dead animal skin around themselves because winter was becoming unbearable. As societies became more complex, clothing stopped being just about class or status. It also became one of humanity's favourite ways to separate men and women into carefully organised social roles. And history took this responsibility extremely seriously. Different cultures created strict expectations about how men should dress, how women should dress, what colours they could wear, how much skin they could show, how long their hair should be, and even how they were allowed to stand, walk, or sit while wearing certain garments. Humanity essentially turned fabric into a full-time behavioural instruction manual. In many ancient societies, men's clothing emphasised strength, authority, or military readiness. Women's clothing often emphasised modesty, fertility, beauty, or domestic roles. Loose robes, layered gowns, veils, jewellery, armour, belts, hairstyles. Every detail slowly became connected to larger ideas about masculinity and femininity. And once societies establish appearance rules, people become deeply emotional about them, almost immediately. In ancient Rome, respectable women wore garments different from prostitutes or enslaved women. Medieval Europe associated long flowing hair with femininity and virtue. In some cultures, warriors wore highly decorative clothing that modern societies might consider flamboyant, proving once again that fashion rules are largely invented and change constantly depending on the century. High heels themselves originally became popular among aristocratic men before later shifting toward women's fashion. which means somewhere in history, a nobleman proudly walked through a palace in heels while confidently believing future generations would absolutely understand his vision. They did not. Clothing also physically shaped behavior. Long skirts restricted movement. Heavy robes changed posture. Tight garments controlled body shape. Certain outfits made physical labor difficult, reinforcing social expectations about who should work and who should remain decorative. Victorian women later perfected this concept by dressing themselves like beautiful but medically compromised furniture. But even in earlier eras, clothing often limited freedom intentionally. Restrictive garments symbolized wealth because they proved the wearer did not need practical mobility. If you could barely walk without assistance, congratulations. Society assumed you were rich enough to avoid useful tasks entirely. Men faced pressures too. Armor was heavy. Ceremonial uniforms were uncomfortable. Royal fashion could become absurdly elaborate. Across history, countless men quietly suffered inside layers of decorative fabric because appearing powerful mattered more than comfort, which really unites humanity beautifully. No matter the century, people consistently chose social approval over physical well-being. And perhaps that is why clothing became so emotionally important. Garments did not just cover the body anymore. They shaped identity itself. People learned how to behave, attract others, gain respect, and fit into society partly through clothing. By this point in history, humans were no longer simply wearing clothes. In many ways, the clothes were beginning to wear them. At some point, clothing stopped being mainly about survival, modesty, or social order, and became something else entirely: luxury. Humans had now reached the stage where fabric itself could become a display of wealth so extreme that entire fortunes were spent on garments designed mainly to impress other wealthy people standing nearby pretending not to care. Civilization was progressing beautifully. As trade routes expanded across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, rare materials became highly valuable. Silk from China amazed foreign civilizations with its softness and shine. Fine cotton, velvet, lace, satin, and exotic dyes became symbols of status. Wealthy elites competed constantly through clothing, often wearing outfits so expensive they could have fed entire villages for months. But feeding peasants rarely sparkled under candlelight, so priorities remained clear. Silk became especially prized because producing it required enormous labor and long-distance trade. In some societies, only royalty or nobles could legally wear certain silks or colors. Merchants crossed deserts and oceans transporting luxury fabrics because humans are apparently willing to risk death for sufficiently attractive textiles. And honestly, they still are. Luxury fashion also became intentionally impractical. Long trains dragged through dirt. Sleeves widened to ridiculous proportions. Delicate fabrics tore easily. Massive wigs required constant maintenance. Clothing became less about function and more about proving the wearer lived above ordinary life. A wealthy person dressed in fragile white silk was essentially announcing, "I personally never carry anything heavier than political opinions." Jewelry expanded alongside luxury clothing. Gold embroidery, pearls, gemstones, silver thread, fur trim, decorative buttons, and elaborate lace transformed garments into walking displays of financial power. European courts became especially obsessed with excess. Kings and nobles competed endlessly through appearance, often changing outfits multiple times per day. Which sounds exhausting, honestly. Ancient farmers probably owned one shirt and slept peacefully every night, while aristocrats suffered emotional breakdowns over ribbon coordination. Luxury clothing also created enormous industries. Entire cities specialized in weaving, dyeing, tailoring, embroidery, shoemaking, and jewelry production. Fashion became a major economic force connecting continents through trade networks, and naturally, counterfeit luxury appeared almost immediately. Cheaper imitations flooded markets as ordinary people tried copying elite styles without elite budgets. Humanity invented fake designer culture centuries before modern handbags. Some things truly never change. Perhaps the strangest part is how emotional luxury clothing became. Expensive garments represented aspiration, power, beauty, and social acceptance all at once. People risked debt, ridicule, and even punishment to appear wealthier through clothing, because by now, humanity had attached enormous psychological meaning to appearance. Clothing was no longer just something humans wore. It had become a dream people wrapped around themselves, hoping others would believe it too. By the time ancient civilizations grew into massive empires, clothing had become something far bigger than personal expression. It became a symbol of civilization itself. People judged entire cultures based on appearance. The Greeks and Romans often described foreign tribes as barbaric, partly because of how they dressed. To wealthy Romans, proper civilization meant clean tunics, arranged hairstyles, sandals, jewelry, and carefully maintained